This is the new 2023 Toyota Supra with a 6-speed manual transmission. I first reviewed the new Toyota Supra almost 3 years ago when it first came out. Back then it only offered an automatic. Then they gave it a power boost. That was like 2 years ago when I reviewed that one. Then earlier this year they announced the manual transmission and I took you on a tour of that one. And now finally I am fully reviewing and driving the new Supra with a manual transmission. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website for cool cars from the modern era with free listings. You can list your cool car for free and auction it on Cars and Bids. And we've had some great sales recently, including this wonderful Nissan GT-R sold for $68,000. This fantastic BMW M3 CS brought just under $65,000. And this wonderful Rivian R1T pickup truck sold for just under $95,000. We've done great with Rivians on Cars and Bids. If you're looking to buy or sell a cool enthusiast car from the modern era, Cars and Bids is the place to do it. With daily auctions, great selection, and free listings, check it out at carsandbids.com. All right, time for the quirks and features of the manual Supra. Although I have reviewed a lot of Supras. Like I said, when it first came out, when they boosted the power, and then I did a thorough tour of the manual Supra earlier this year before I could drive it. So this video is mainly going to focus on driving experience, but I do want to at least go over a few basics before I get behind the wheel. We'll start with exactly what's going on. The Supra came out for the 2020 model year, and at that time it only offered an automatic transmission and a 6-cylinder, which was 335 horsepower. Now, later, they added a 4-cylinder option, 255 horsepower, and they boosted the 6-cylinder's power to about 380 horses. So base model, 255 horse 4-cylinder, and then you can opt for the 380 horse 6-cylinder. And now for 2023, they're offering a 6-speed manual. It's only going to be available with the 6-cylinder. The 4-cylinder still automatic only, but the 6-cylinder you can choose between a manual or an automatic at no cost. The new 23 Supra starts around $54,500 with an automatic or with a manual. No extra cost for the manual or the automatic. It's the same price regardless of which you choose. Now, as everybody knows by now, the new Supra is powered by BMW. BMW engines drive the new Supra. And if you don't know that, you open up the hood, you see a big Toyota logo, you look just a little bit closer, and you see a big BMW logo. One of the first things you see under the hood, this car is clearly BMW powered. The Supra shares its chassis, its underpinnings, its powertrain, a lot of the interior and tech with the new BMW Z4. These two cars built very closely, developed very closely, except the Z4 is a convertible and the Supra offers a manual. BMW does not offer a manual transmission Z4 here in North America, and they don't offer a manual transmission with this powertrain at all on any vehicles globally. So Toyota had to create one. And apparently what they really did was adapt the manual transmission that's offered on the base model entry-level Z4 that's sold in Europe. We don't get that manual here in the States, but the Z4 does get it in Europe. And so they took that and they had to adapt it for the larger powertrain to make it work with this engine. And that's exactly what they did. Now, I have absolutely no doubt that this transmission had to go through a lot of changes in order to be adapted for this powertrain, since it wasn't originally designed for it. But Toyota told me about 6 months ago that this transmission was completely new from the ground up. That doesn't seem to be true, especially based on driving the car. Feels very BMW-ish, which I'll get to when I get behind the wheel in a few minutes. But regardless, major changes to the transmission in order to work with this powertrain, and it's the only car with this engine and a stick. But anyway, let's talk through some other changes to the new Supra in order to create the manual transmission model. Probably the most obvious is the center console had to be rearranged because the gear selector for a manual transmission is wider and bigger than what you had for the automatic. So they had to move things around to still have room for the controller for the infotainment system and to provide enough room to actually easily and comfortably shift gears in this car. Now, interestingly, when you shift gears in the manual Supra, it tells you what gear you're in the gauge cluster in real time. You can see going through the gears, it actually shows you as if you didn't know from the placement of the gear selector, which is kind of odd. But then again, I actually think it looks cool, and the gauge cluster in general looks cool. In fact, this is one of my very favorite gauge clusters in any car today. I love the font they use, the layout, the design. Now, it's not as informative or configurable as some cars' gauge clusters, but in a sports car, maybe it doesn't have to be. Not everybody wants that info when they're driving fast. Instead, they want something cool, which this gauge cluster certainly is. Now, as for the manual transmission, it has a rev matching function, which I'll talk more about later. That comes standard with all manual Supras. Toyota says they've also adjusted the final drive ratio and the gear ratios for better acceleration, and they've recalibrated the traction and stability control to fit with a manual transmission. And yes, indeed, this car has the 3 pedals, which look like they have a little man on them. Doesn't that look like a little person on the pedals? Once you see it, you can't look at the pedals and see anything else. The manual Supra, you press on the clutch and you're pressing on this little man. Now, it was originally reported by some outlets, and if you Google, you can find out who, because they're still reporting this incorrect information, but it was originally reported by some outlets that manual transmission Supras would have red badging as opposed to the black badging on standard Supra models. I thought this would be a cool idea, a distinctive touch for manuals, a little subtle thing on the outside where you could tell it was a manual car. Honda did this in the mid-2000s with the Accord V6. Automatic Accord V6 models had a black V6 badge, manuals had a red V6 badge, and I thought it would be cool if Toyota did the same, but that is not the case. Instead, the red Supra badge is going to be saved for a special edition model called the A91 MT. As you can imagine with its name, all of the A91 MT models have a manual transmission. They're only going to make 500 units, and they're all going to be finished in matte gray or matte white with a brown interior, colors that aren't offered on the standard Supra, and they will all have red badging, which will be cool. They also have some other upgrades too, mostly cosmetic stuff, better wheels, a better sound system, Alcantara shift knob, red strut tower braces, a little distinguishing features here and there to make it a little bit more special, and that A91 MT version is going to start around $59,500, so about $5,000 more if you can get the cool special edition. And by the way, I've mentioned prices for the regular Supra around $54,500 and the A91 MT $59,500. The standard base model 4-cylinder Supra for 2023 is going to start around $44,500. All these prices with shipping, so $44,500 for a 4-cylinder auto, or you can step up to the big leagues. Now, other changes for the 2023 model year for the Supra, not really substantial, but there are a few. One is this color. It's called Stratosphere Blue, and it's offered on all Supra models, not just manuals, but this is the color, and frankly, I think it looks pretty good. Toyota says they have also made updates to the power steering system for the Supra, I guess to make it feel more athletic and exciting, and they've revised the suspension system, presumably for the same goal. Toyota says they have also come out with a new feature in 23 Supra models called Hairpin Plus, which is apparently intended for tight uphill turns to allow the wheels to rotate at even greater speed differentials for tighter cornering, as tight as possible, that Hairpin Plus feature on 23 Supras. Other than that, though, the big change is the manual, so let's get behind the wheel and see how it drives. All right, driving the new manual transmission Supra, and what an interesting experience this is. I feel like this is a General Motors product strategy decision. They used to come out with a car, and then they would refine the car over its life cycle and come out with the very best version of the car only at the end. And it feels like that's kind of what Toyota has done here to an extent. Supra came out in 20 with an automatic and a 6-cylinder only, and it was a little underpowered, and the fact that it was auto only was disappointing. Finally, they've given it more power and a manual, but here we are 4 years into the model cycle. People are already kind of getting over the new Supra. There's a new Z out that's a very compelling alternative. A new Mustang is coming out. There's all sorts of hot hatchbacks on the market with performance that rivals this car. And the new Supra doesn't quite feel like the cool, hot thing that it was initially. But at least the manual is here and we can rejoice. So let's talk about how the manual feels. I mentioned earlier it feels like a BMW manual transmission. That's not the highest praise when it's coming from me. At least in terms of modern BMW manual transmissions, they generally have two issues. One is that the clutch feels a little too springy, and the other is that the shifter usually feels a little too kind of rubbery and vague. I'm happy to report the second of those issues does not seem to be the case with this car. The shifter doesn't feel rubbery, it doesn't feel vague at all. It's nice and notchy, it goes in perfectly, it's totally smooth, it's exactly what you'd expect. I love shifting gears in this car, especially with the rev match feature, which I'll get back to in a second. However, the clutch is too springy. This is a BMW issue in modern BMW cars with manual transmissions. Clutch is just too springy. It's hard to execute like a really smooth just upshift even in regular daily driving. That's not hard, but you have to think about it. And in so many good manual transmission cars, you just don't. I recently drove the new Civic Type R yesterday, in fact, and it just has such a great clutch and shifter. It just feels so perfect and so good and so smooth. And you drive it back to back with this car, and you can tell what like a perfect clutch is versus what this car has, which is a fine clutch, but not perfect. So that's the basic situation with the manual transmission in this car. Clutch is good, acceptable, shifter is great, but most importantly, it just livens up the damn thing so much. The car, I've always felt that the new Supra got dealt kind of a bad hand because the old one is so vaunted with its 2JZ and everybody loves it and it's such an icon, and this car was never really going to be able to be a good successor to that. But if you take that away from it, this is a damn good car. It's little, it's tossable, it feels really well balanced, excellently poised, the powertrain is really potent. The original 6-cylinder was pretty good, and the updated one with more power is really good. And this car is actually pretty damn good. The problem was always we all felt it was kind of neutered by only having an automatic transmission. And so then you add that with the BMW thing and it didn't feel like a real Supra. Well, now we get the stick back, we got more power. BMW makes great platforms and great engines. I don't really see the BMW aspect as a problem. And I think that this car is now like totally livened up and totally more exciting and exactly what it should have been when it first came out 4 years ago. Now, let's talk about driving day to day. One thing is the rev matching feature. It's great, as a lot of these rev matching features are. I will note one interesting drawback of it. The revs fall pretty quickly if you don't immediately downshift. So if you get out of your gear and kind of tap the next gear down, it immediately rev matches, as they all do. But then if you don't go into it, you kind of lose the gear pretty quick. And so you have to either make your decision. You can't just dilly-dally. Not really a big deal, but like I was driving the Honda Civic Type R, which had a similar feature. That car just does it better. The revs hang for a long time, allowing you to enter the gear basically whenever you want. Not quite as smooth in this car, unless you're ready to downshift right away. Oh. That was a nice downshift and a nice ride. This car is fast and the manual just livens it up so much. I feel like this is such a great car. This is exactly the world of car I like to live in too. Roughly this size, roughly this power, manual, tossable. I love cars like this. And I really think that this new Supra is, especially with a stick shift, is gonna go down as a truly special car. I just think they're going to be rare. Not as many people are buying the Supra now that it's been out for a few years. They're pretty pricey. Sports cars in general are slowing down, but I think in 20 years we're going to look back on the manual Supras from this gen as pretty impressive cars. Daily drivability, totally possible. This car is nice and comfortable, luxurious. It's got good tech. I've reviewed a bunch of previous Supra models. You can check out those videos to kind of see how the features all work. But this is a good car, and now it's a really nice driving car. It's a lot of fun. It's enjoyable. The manual really livens things up, makes it more exciting. It's a good transmission, and the car just feels fast, feels alive. And I think previously it didn't quite have that emotional connection. And now it does. And I think they've done a great job adding the stick shift. I think they've integrated fantastically. And I think that this has gone from being like a pretty decent car you turn your head at to like a great car that it's such a shame this comes out late in its model cycle when people aren't really talking about it anymore. And so that's the new 2023 Toyota Supra with a manual transmission. This car has been controversial, but I feel like it finally is what it should have been from the beginning. It's gotten a power boost, now there's a manual transmission, it drives great, and frankly, I am finally excited about the new Supra. Anyway, now it's time to give the manual Supra a Doug score. And the Doug score is here, 63 out of 100, which is a good number that places the manual Supra ahead of most of its rivals. The new Z, the outgoing Mustang GT, the GR86 and BRZ, and most importantly, other Supra models. Frankly, I think it took Toyota 3 years, but they finally got this right. The Supra is finally back how we wanted it.